King Jr. National Historical Park. A great leader is born. A young boy grows up in a time of segregation. A dreamer is moved by destiny into leadership of the modern civil rights movement. This was Martin Luther King Jr. Come hear his history, visit the home of his birth and where he played as a child. Walk in his footsteps and hear his voice in a church where he moved hearts and minds. Marvel at how he was an instrument for social change. Who was Martin Luther King Jr.? Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, and died on April 4, 1968. Was an American Baptist minister and activist who became the most visible spokesman and leader for the civil rights movement. King led many peaceful protests. On October 14, 1964, King won the Nobel Peace Prize for combating racial inequality. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. In 1977, posthumously, King was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. King changed the course of history. Visitor Center. This is the place to stop for a brief orientation to the historic site, which facilities are open. How to sign up for birth home tour. Peace Rose Garden. The International World Peace Rose Gardens program is a worldwide effort to help youth recognize the importance and value of peace. In March 1992, the Martin Luther King Jr. I Have a Dream World Peace Rose Garden was planted at the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site. Birth home. In 1895, a two-story framed Queen Anne style house was built for a white family at 501 Auburn Avenue. The home was purchased in 1909 by Rev. Adam Daniel Williams, pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, for $3,500. Historic Fire Station 6. Now what?
Park buildings are temporarily closed as we are following CDC guidelines at this time. We have created this 3-minute video as a virtual guide to the exhibits within Historic Fire Station number 6. Welcome to Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park, a unit of the National Park Service. We are at Historic Fire Station number 6. Fire Station number 6 is a beautiful 1894 red brick Romanesque Revival fire station, designed by Bruce and Morgan for the Atlanta Fire Department. Inside the fire station, you'll see a LaFrance fire truck from the 1930s time period, the time when Dr. King was growing up here on Auburn Avenue. On the fire station walls, you will see panels on the history
Ebenezer Baptist Church. Ebenezer Baptist Church, located in Atlanta, Georgia, has been spiritual home to many citizens of the Sweet Auburn community. Its most famous member, Rev. Martin Luther King Jr., was baptized as a child in the church. After giving a trial sermon to the congregation at Ebenezer at the age of 19, Martin was ordained as a minister. In 1960, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. became a co-pastor of Ebenezer with his father, Rev. Martin Luther King Sr., known as Daddy King. The King Center. Miss Coretta Scott King established the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, Incorporated, in 1968 to preserve the legacy of her husband while at the King Center visit the final resting place of Dr. King Jr. and exhibits on him, Coretta Scott King, and Mahatma Gandhi. The National Park Tour.
Hi, my name is Ranger Marty Smith, and we're going to go inside of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And when we go inside of Ebenezer Baptist Church, what I'm going to do, I'm going to share with you some history of what the neighborhood was like during that period of time, some history of the church, and also share with you some history of Dr. King's funeral service. So today, what I'd like to talk to you about is the Sweet Auburn community. This community that you're in right now was considered to be one of your wealthiest African-American neighborhoods in the United States. They had about 4 or 5 black millionaires come off the street. What happened was the blacks had owned their own business in the downtown district of Atlanta. They was kicked out of that district. This was the only area they could go to start their own business. So since their backs against the walls and they had no one else to support them, they started their own insurance companies, their own banks, funeral homes, newspapers, radio stations, and pharmacies. What made this community so successful was, if you own your own insurance company and I own my own bank, you made me the chairman of the board of your insurance company, while I made you the chairman of the board of my bank, so our money could circulate inside the community. So even though America at the time was going through a Great Depression, this community was still thriving, still doing well, because these people was working and supporting each other. So not only do we feel that those stories of Dr. King are very important, but we feel that it's equally important to share the stories about this community, because this community had a definite impact on Dr. King's life.